to discuss Albert Pike. We're going to read from some of his literature, some of his poems. We're going to discuss who he was, what he did in his life, how he was an author, a statesman, a lecturer, a poet, a teacher. He ran an editor of a magazine. I mean, he's done so much in his life. He's a very controversial, very misconstrued figure. And basically, we're just going to hack at him today. Just take a look at who Albert Pike truly was, as opposed to what everybody thinks he was. So today we're going to talk about what really went on during the Civil War, as far as what we can gather from, the fog of war and the fog of history, what was really going on in the Civil War, why the Civil War was fought, how what is happening today is essentially a recapitulation of what was happening about 160 years ago or whatever it was now. And we're going to learn everything from Albert Pike, Confederate general of the South, so fought for the South, fought for the Confederacy against the North. And so everybody assumes that he was some evil, slave-owning, whatever, right? Freemason and all this other stuff. So we're just going to try to clear the air, is all essentially what we're going to do today. Just so everybody knows, if you're new to this channel, or if you don't know who I am, or you turned this on, it's like, what is this guy talking about? I've been studying Masonry on and off since, I think I picked my first book up on Masonry when I was maybe 27, 28 years old or something like that. I'm about 41 right now. So I've been reading Masonry for at least a decade, if not more. Okay, so there's that. And so I've read Albert Pike. I have the Book of the Words and their Masonic meanings. I've got Morals and Dogma. I've read The Lodge of Perfection. I've read a bunch of his poems, which we'll read some of that today. So the reason that we're talking about Albert Pike is, as you saw from this, from the opening of the live stream, if you didn't see it, Albert Pike took Albie sat on a wall, Albie had a great fall, all the BLM and all the Antifa hung a white man in the square or some shit. I don't know. So anyway, the statue of Albert Pike went down in Washington Square. And so this was a big uproar because everybody was like, yeah, that's right. They took the Luciferian Satanists down. Ugh. Okay, so who was Confederate General Albert Pike? And why was his statue in D.C. in the first place? Everybody thinks that Albert Pike wrote a bunch of stuff. He was working with the Illuminati, and he was a Freemason that was behind the scenes, and he was a racist, and he just didn't like them Negroes. That's what everybody believes. So if you punch in Albert Pike, and you can go ahead and do this right now. You put in Albert Pike 3. That's all you have to put in. You're going to get a bunch of articles about Albert Pike's 3 world wars, about how he started. Albert Pike wrote about the 3 world wars. Don't you guys know? It's all, Oh, do I have a? Oh yeah, here we go. There's a ton of Google searches. That's the first thing that'll come up. And of course, this is the quote, and everybody quotes this. Whenever you see a quote from Albert Pike, it will be one of 3 or 4 quotes. This will be one of them, taken out, which is he didn't even write. Albert Pike did not even say this. But it says, the Third World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences caused by the agentur of the Illuminati between the political Zionists and the leaders of the Islamic world. The war must be conducted in such a way that Islam and political Zionism mutually destroy each other. Just so you guys know, the guy who wrote that, it's attributed to a guy that was well known to be a fictional writer who wrote all sorts of crazy shit about Masons. It's well known. Do you know how easy it is to debunk this 3 World War quote? It's so easy. It doesn't even take that long. Yet nobody did it. Name a truth seeker out there. I can almost guarantee they've probably put that quote in one of their videos. It's bullshit. And you can actually tie it to exactly who the guy was that is responsible for basically, essentially putting out all of this nonsense about Masonry. Guess who he was? Well, the guy's name was Leo Taxil. And Leo Taxil was an impostor that deceived many French Catholics. He was a fictional writer that made up people and made up a bunch of stuff and blamed, one of the people that he blamed was Albert Pike. As it goes on to say, Taxil was variously known in this place, but he was a renegade Jesuit. He was a renegade Jesuit. He wrote articles about about Pike was a Luciferian and all this other stuff. Well known to be a fiction writer. He even made up this woman called, and you can look this up, guys, Diana Vaughn. Made up this Diana Vaughn and how she was involved with Masonry, and she was the head of a satanic Luciferian church, and General Pike, and that was a completely made up person. Then he actually enlisted Albert Pike in his little fictional world. And Albert Pike was known as the Pope of the Luciferians. And people run with this today. All you have to do is look up and you can find out exactly who started this shit. It was a fictional writer. Pike was a Boston native. Traveled with fur trappers and traders. He settled in Arkansas. He was a noted poet, an author, a teacher, a statesman, and a war general, a lawyer. He was an orator. He was a lecturer. like I said, an author of poetry, all this other stuff, right? Symbologist, comparative mythologist. The guy was what is known as a polymath. A polymath is what Albert Pike was, okay? A polymath, poly means many and math means math, okay? Which basically means you're really, really smart in a bunch of subjects. That's all that means, okay? By 1837, Albert Pike was practicing law, and he often represented Native Americans in disputes with the federal government. So Albert Pike, the leader of the KKK, which he wasn't, Pope of the Luciferians, which he wasn't, British, started the KKK, all that sort of, he wasn't any of that stuff. But you know what he did do, and we'll cover it today. He was a lawyer who fought on behalf of the Native Americans of many different tribes against the federal government. And he won. And guess what the federal government never did? Paid the fuck up. They never paid. So Albert, as we'll learn more today as we move on, Albert Pike actually defended Native Americans and fought for their land. Pike said in 1875, "I took my obligations from white men, not from Negroes. When I have to accept Negroes as brothers or leave Masonry, I shall leave it." Now, the only problem is Pike never said that shit. There's nothing anywhere in any of his letters, any of his books, anything that has his name on it that ever said that. Do you know what that is? It's another ruse. As soon as Pike died, as soon as the South lost the war, what you'll see is, I'll actually show you. I only got one instance of it, but you'll see the newspapers immediately started bashing this guy, literally trying to make him into this Luciferian character, which he was nothing of the sort. So he never said this. He never said, "Oh, I'm going to leave Masonry if the Negroes start it." Pike was considered by his contemporaries as being one of the least racially biased individuals of his time. And you'll see this, guys. Once again, you can do the work yourself. During his military service in the U.S. Civil War, he chose to lead only Native Indian troops, something others eschewed because of the perception that Indians were subhuman. They were savages. His position on slavery is sometimes or almost always assumed because of his service in the Confederacy. Yet that assumption reflects ignorance on the beliefs of well-read gentlemen living in the South and a feeling of obligation to support his country. We'll go over all this today. Just so you know, he actually said this. So it says, the status of Negro Masonry in this country was perhaps never better defined than it was by Albert Pike in 1875 when he actually said this. And this you can go find. Prince Hall Lodge was a regular lodge as any lodge created by competent authority. It had a perfect right to establish other lodges and make itself a mother lodge. I'm going to read that again, Prince Hall Lodge was as regular a Freemasonic lodge as any lodge created by any contemporary authority. It had a perfect right to establish other lodges and make itself a mother lodge. Do you guys know what the Prince Hall Lodge is? It's a masonry that is essentially exclusively for blacks. That was Prince Hall. Once again, in 1875, they were starting lodges. And Albert Pike didn't say, "Yeah, if those Negroes start a lodge, we're going to go burn it down." He was like, they have an absolute right to start a lodge. And if they want to make other lodges, they are in complete authority to do so. Prince Hall is black masonry. So this comes from Morals and Dogma. This is what he actually says about race. Toleration, holding that every other man has the same right to his opinion and faith that we have to ours. And liberality, holding that as no human being can with certainty say, in the clash and conflict of hostile faith and creeds, what is truth, or that he is surely in possession of it. So everyone should feel that it is quite possible that another equally honest and sincere with himself, and yet holding the contrary opinion, may himself be in possession of the truth, and that whatever one firmly and conscientiously believes is truth to him, these are the mortal enemies of that fanaticism which persecutes for opinion's sake and initiates crusades against whatever it, in its imaginary wholeness, deems to be contrary to the law of God or verity of dogma. And education, instruction, and enlightenment are the most certain means by which fanaticism and intolerance can be rendered powerless. But I'm just going to read a few passages from Morals and Dogma, just to actually read, listen to what Albert Pike actually said. Life is the wonderful creation of God. It is light sprung from the void of darkness, power waked from inertness and impotence, being created from nothing. and the contrast may well enkindle wonder and delight. It is a rill from the infinite, overflowing goodness, and from the moment when it first gushes up into the light to that when it mingles with the ocean of eternity, that goodness attends it and ministers to it. It is a great and glorious gift. There is gladness in its infant voices, joy in the buoyant step of its youth, deep satisfaction in its strong maturity, and peace in its quiet age. There is good for the good, virtue for the faithful, and victory for the valiant. There is, even in this humble life, an infinity for those whose desires are boundless. There are blessings upon its birth. There is hope in its death, and eternity in its prospect. Thus earth, which binds many in chains, is to the Mason both the starting place and the goal of immortality. Many it buries in the rubbish of dull cares and wearying vanities, but to the Mason it is the lofty mount of meditation where heaven and infinity and eternity are spread out before him and are all around him. To the lofty-minded, the pure and the virtuous, this life is the beginning of heaven and part of immortality. All work is noble. A life of ease is not for any man, nor for any god. The Almighty Maker is not like one who, in old immemorial ages, having made his machine of a universe, sits ever since and sees it go. Out of that belief comes atheism. The faith in an invisible, unnameable, directing deity present everywhere in all that we see and work and suffer is the essence of all faith whatsoever. There is a perennial nobleness and even sacredness in this work. Should we do one more? No, that's good. Anyway, Morals and Dogma is filled with these uplifting, just, almost like these long poetic passages about finding your inner light, living a better life, helping your fellow man, reaching out. If you learn, you teach, you do what's right because it's the right thing to do, not because you're going to receive a reward or you're going to get some fucking red carpet rolled out for you. You do what's right because it's the right thing to do, end of story, period. That's what you learn in Morals and Dogma. That's what you'll learn if you actually read it and take it seriously. Pike was an attorney, Confederate general, poet. He was a multilinguist. He knew a bunch of different languages. He was a teacher, an author, a poet. He ran his own newspaper. He was a statesman. He went to war. In 1837, he was admitted to the bar and practiced primarily in the Indian Territory, representing Native Americans disputes with he represented Native Americans in disputes with the federal government. Pike was listen to this. All those people that's like, he was just a Confederate Southern general that just hated all the Negroes, and he just wanted to have sex with all the black women and keep thousands of slaves, and that's what people assume. Started the KKK. Pike was an early vocal opponent of secession. He didn't want the Union to break up. He wasn't like, we're going our own way because we want to keep the Negroes. Not at all. He was fighting for Native Americans in court, won against the federal government. When he died, the federal government never paid the fuck up. That's what you need to know, because that's going to tell you everything you need to know about what was actually going on in the Civil War. Taught school, wrote poetry, and prose for the Little Rock Advocate, became the newspaper editor in 1833. Prior to serving in the Mexican War, Pike practiced law in the U.S. Supreme Court. He represented the Creek Nation of Indian Territory in a claim for ceded tribal land. The federal government came, took land. He fought them and actually won. Although Pike won the cases, insufficient reparations were awarded to the tribes in 1856 and 1857. Since we're going to talk about race today, I'll just piss some people off. They reneged on the deal, if you know what I'm saying. Okay? Pike was known as a great Mason. Even after the war, before the war, he was known as a great man. Why? Well, because he wasn't just some crazy, Negro-hating Confederate general. They knew him for what he actually was and what he actually stood for. Now, that's completely been lost in our time. So I actually went to the National Archives and just dug a bunch of stuff up for you guys because that's the kind of prick I am. General Pike's Masonic lecture. So this is one of the things I found, right? Considering the brief time of notice, there was a large gathering of Masons at their hall last evening to listen to the lecture of General Albert Pike. Okay? Beginning at about 8:30, the venerable brother sitting and in a familiar and conversational way, but with a fullness and force of voice that easily made itself understood throughout the hall, kept his large audience until 12. So about 3.5 hours he spoke, almost spellbound. His exposition of symbols with which the craftsmen supposed themselves familiar brought out new revelations that astonished and delighted them. It was voted the best intellectual Masonic treat that has ever been furnished in the history of Helena. In other words, the Masons were like, this guy knows his shit. So one of the best lectures, what do they say? Furnished in the history of Helena. Shit. I wish I was there, man. They probably had some like good scotch and listening to Pike freaking drone on about who knows what, you know? Now, Pike was a complex individual. He was known back in the day that normies, if you will, your standard everyday just common person, he was so ahead of the game, he was so sophisticated, they couldn't even understand him. His house was fitted up elegantly, and his library was of rare and standard works, many of them imported. It excelled in the standard English authors, and there were several thousand volumes in French. He had thousands of volumes of books in French. Why? Because he spoke multiple languages. Besides this, he had some rare pictures and the finest engravings ever published. One room was devoted to philosophical apparatus, and the natural sciences were familiar to him. He was a scientist. He was, like I said, he was doing all of it. Many did not understand him and disliked or rather sneered at him. He has no common sense, says one. Why? He spends all his money for books, pictures, wine, and sport. Another said there was something wrong, or Pike would have been a great man in the political world. He was a great man in the political world. He just wasn't a politician. Do you know why Pike probably wasn't a politician? Because politicians were well known back in the day, and we should really revitalize and re-energize this idea, but that politicians were fucking scumbags. They were pigs. So Albert Pike, the Pope of the Luciferians, KKK founder, Satanist, full-on Satanist, right? He wrote a book of poems, and in one of those was called, one of the poems was called Christmas. So, Christmas time is drawing near, the pleasant Christmas time. Let us hail its coming cheerfully with a song of rude old rhyme, a good rough song like those that when old England yet was young, under old Saxon rafters with a jolly chorus rung, and round shall pass the merry glass, grim care will drive away, and music and dance shall greet the gladsome Christmas day. A 4-page poem about Christmas, not about hating them Negroes. Nope. We can forgive those that have done us wrong, draw closer to old friends and make affection's bonds more strong, create more sunlight on life's ways, more starlight in the heart, and get us ready for the time when we must hence depart. So we may live in peace with all, and when we pass away, look back without a bitter thought to this fair Christmas day. That's 33rd degree Satanist, founder of the KKK, Negro hater, Albert Pike, writing a 4-page poem about Christmas. Okay, moving on. The work of Albert Pike. Many leaders of the 5 tribes welcomed the formation of the Confederate States of America in February 1861. Wait, what? Wait, what? 5 tribes, these are the native tribes in the South. Okay? So, wait a second. Many leaders of the 5 tribes welcomed the formation of the Confederate States of America in February 1861. The Confederacy, why were the Native Americans fighting for the evil South that hated? There were Native Americans fighting literally right beside people that were enslaving Negroes? Wait, what's going on here? Or maybe you and I got a big old dollop of bullshit when we were taught this stuff. I don't know. Okay. The Confederacy, as it was known, consisted of southern states that seceded, withdrawn from the United States. It moved quickly to take advantage of this sentiment. Confederate President Jefferson Davis appointed Albert Pike, a prominent Arkansas attorney, editor, and Freemason, to negotiate treaties with the tribes. Pike set out for Indian Territory in late May. He was going to literally make peace with natives. Like, be like, look, and as we'll find out, like, look, the North is coming. They're going to destroy your way of life, and we're going to protect you. That's actually what was going on. Albert Pike was the only white Southerner. Albert Pike left the Civil War as the only white Southerner to lead an all-Native American force in battle. He returned to Arkansas to practice law and became a national figure in Freemasonry. He died in Washington, D.C. in 1891. Albert Pike left the Civil War as the only white Southerner. So now people are going to say, well, yeah, that's right, because he, with his persuasive tongue, convinced all those Native Americans and all those disparate and separate tribes to all come together and give their life up for slave owners. I mean, how belittling and condescending can you possibly be to the Native Americans? It's like those Native Americans, they were so fucking dumb. All it took was some big ass Freemason to come and be like, "Oh, follow me, give up your life for us black hating slave owners," or some shit. Obviously, what we're told is nonsense. You mean separate tribes? They were not hanging out together. They had different cosmologies and practices and rituals and stuff like that. But for some reason, for the Civil War, they all got together and fought with slave owners. Huh? Well, that just don't make a lick of sense. Albert Pike was 300 pounds. Big dude, man. Essentially a giant. At 300 pounds, he was a physically imposing man. He became a poet, lawyer, planter. That's right. He was a farmer and newspaper publisher. Pike was a Whig and stood opposed to Arkansas secession. He did not want the Union to break up. He wanted the country to stay together. He's like, no, I don't want this. But what happened was the North forced them. He wanted to keep the Union together, but the North weren't having it. On the breaking out of the rebellion, Pike. So there was a big war. It was called, or a big fight. It was called the Battle of Pea Ridge, and this is where Pike actually got literally thousands and thousands of natives. Not even got them. They decided to fight with the Confederacy under General Pike's rule. So this is the Battle of Pea Ridge. I'll just show this. So this is a very famous battle. Okay, North versus South. This is where General Pike. There was about 35,000 men that were ready to defend the South. Okay. The Indians raised a force of 3,000 men for the war. Now, the numbers vary. It's up to, like, I've heard 1,000. I read a couple different articles that said 1,000, 3,000, 5,000. Either way, a whole lot of Native Americans armed up and were ready to go and fight the North. Our Indian allies are doing well and are rendering excellent service. About 13 regiments, I can barely see what this is, nearly 10,000 men are in service, representing chiefly the Cherokee, Creeks, Choctaw, and Chicka something, and a few other tribes. General Albert Pike, whose acquaintance with the Indian character, habits, and interests with the confidence reposed in him. Anyway, it's a bunch of different tribes getting together. Here it's saying 10,000 men. The Confederate General Albert Pike had civilized Indians from the Indian Territory fighting under him at Pea Ridge. After the battle, there was many a men lying dead on the field in blue uniform who had been scalped. The Red Confederates could not rise out of old habits. Another drawback would be the insuperable objection that gallant red men had to wearing trousers. Basically, this was after the war, after this battle at Pea Ridge. What happened is they all died. What did they do? In the article, there's like, savages went and scalped them all. Well, it's fucking war. It's war. That's what Indians did. You were an enemy. 3 days of fighting. A bunch of people died. Pike was in there. I think Van Dorn, McCullough, and Price. I think those guys died, all fighting the North. During the first years of the war, the South had greater generals than the North. As early as the summer of 1861, the Confederacy sent an emissary, west to stir up the Indians against the United States government. They're making a conspiracy about Albert Pike. Albert Pike went and actually was like, no, the North are coming to take your land. They're coming. They don't give a shit about us in the South. They think we're a bunch of rednecks and hillbillies and dumb fucks and white trash, and they think the same about you, and they're coming for you. So he didn't stir up the Indians. He didn't convince the Indians. The Indians knew what was going on. And as you'll find out. So now after the war, right? So all the newspapers were saying, Albert Pike went and convinced all of these Native Americans to fight on behalf of the South and those evil slave owners. And that's because it was Pike. He convinced them, right? Then what happened after the war? Let's read. After the war, in the North, you betcha, there was an Indian outbreak. But Albert Pike wasn't there to convince all those Native Americans to fight the North. So why did they break out and start fighting the North? Besides, tribes far apart and not on the best of terms with each other are now acting in unison, thus indicating a concerted plan which is to amount to nothing less than a general Indian war throughout the Northwest. This is after the Battle of Pea Ridge. This is after, basically the South was already taken over. What happened? All of those tribes in the North that were not on good terms with one another, they started getting on good terms. We're like, we have to do something. Otherwise, there goes our livelihood, our way of life. The North is going to destroy it. And by the North, as you're going to find out, what I mean is the federal government. In the course of Albert Pike and others instigating the tribes of the Southwest to forfeit their allegiance to the government, and even enrolling the savages among the rebels who sustained the defeat at Plea Ridge, shows sufficiently that the Confederate authorities are competent to a scheme of this kind. They were literally blaming it on the South. They're like, oh, now these northern Indians are fighting us. Let's blame it on the South. It must be them. Any sort of barbarity comes to not amiss to them on the strength of that old principle, probably that birds of a feather flock together. Guerrillas, pirates, savages, all are welcome, for all have a common object in breaking up the model Christian government of modern times. That's what they were saying. They were literally saying that they were a bunch of savages and that all birds of a feather flock together. They were all just, what did he say? Barbarity and all this sort of stuff. Savages, pirates, they're all welcome to fight because they wanted to take down the Christian government. And in Albert Pike's own words, in multiple newspapers, they're saying Albert Pike never wanted the Union to break up. New York Times ran some propaganda, though. Of course. Way back in the day, the Sulzberger family was doing the exact same thing that they are doing now. Propaganda full fucking time. They ran it on Pike. New York Times. Jewish mafia family. Latest advices, they had arrived on the Cherokee neutral lands in Kansas, utterly destitute, with worn out ponies and worn out feet, leaving bloody tracks wherever they went. The concocter and leader of this atrocious massacre of these poor but loyal redskins was the poet Albert Pike. And from that time, he has been gradually transformed into a savage, till now he has taken up arms against his government. They're literally just saying, yeah, he just lost his mind down there. Albert Pike was this great statesman and poet and orator, and he was a teacher and stuff like that, but he was just hanging out with those barbarous savages and red men and, the pirates and shit like that, and he lost his mind, and he was going to fight the federal government because, it's nonsense. All this propaganda that was pushed out after the war, literally, right after, the Battle of Pea Ridge and things like that. Then you had people there was so much propaganda against him. You had people that actually that were defending him. No, Albert Pike was not a Luciferian. You don't have to believe this article. You could just go and read this yourself. Nothing in there, as we've covered before, nothing about him being Luciferian. It's ridiculous. General Albert Pike's friends defend his memory. They say he has been slandered. Albert Pike was slandered. Washingtonians who knew the eminent Freemason and head of the Scottish Rite Order in this country flatly denied the wild story in a New York paper. I can't make this shit up, dude. See, the fact that he was the leader of a sect of devil worshippers. It's a romantic tale. And you're looking at it right now. Yeah, Albert Pike lost his mind when he was hanging down there with all those natives and he just went frickin' crazy and wanted to destroy the government. Really? Really, New York Times? We're going to read from a book, or actually, this is a pamphlet, and I've read this twice now. That's right, I've read this twice now. I read it once before, and I read it again, just for you guys. And a lot of it's boring as shit. It's literally not fun to read. It's just a bunch of, legal mumbo-jumbo and stuff like that, as we'll cover. But this was it was a pamphlet that was sent out, and you can download the PDF and read this yourself, okay? It was a pamphlet that was sent out by Albert Pike before the start of the war, basically telling everybody what was actually going on. So he had this printed up and he was saying, hey, look, I don't want it. Nobody wants secession. Nobody really wanted this, but the North and South are not getting along at all. The North is starting to push their power upon the South, and the South just want to be autonomous. They wanted to follow the Constitution, all that sort of stuff. So this is Albert Pike sent out this pamphlet to all the people in Arkansas to explain them what's going on. Why are we being rushed into war right now when it's really not wanted by a lot of the people? That sounds familiar. Okay, so the first page says this. All experience hath shown, this comes from the Declaration of Independence, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. Think about that. All experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. He goes on to say, this is the first page of this pamphlet, he says, we are in the midst of a revolution, and, as is usual, those who are hurried along in its vortex are, for the most part, ignorant of the real causes that have produced the revolution and of the depth to which the questions involved in the controversy have struck their roots downward among the very foundation stones of the Republic. The first sentence that he writes says that most people are ignorant of the real causes that are starting the Civil War. Just like you could say, most people are ignorant of what's actually going on with this current race war, right? Would you agree? Okay. If there's anybody that says no, I think you pretty much got to go. All right, this is not the string for you. Appeals to the nonsense of the people sometimes prove effectual. Appeals to the nonsense of people sometimes prove effectual. Amen, Brother Pike. And the tendency in all political controversies is to limit and narrow questions and to present them in a practical and empirical manner. Because abstract principles, even when fundamental, do not appeal to most men with 1,000th part the force of considerations of present economy, policy, or expediency. In other words, what he's saying is that when you have to get into the nitty-gritty of what the cause of the war and stuff like that and what's really going on, most people are just, I'm not going to get into that. I'm not going to burn the calories. I'm not going to do the work to do that. Just like now, when you get into the nitty-gritty, the real causes of quote-unquote the race war, most people don't want to get into it. They're just like, George Floyd dead. I can't breathe. Let's burn everything. That's what people think is going on. They think a black man was killed by a cop in the street. They think that that's what's going on. That's not what's going on. It was then important, it is now still more important to understand the real issues between the North and the South and the reach and extent of the principles involved. It is especially essential that the ground of separation should not be misunderstood by any considerable portion of our own people, that a mere corollary should not be mistaken for the essential principle involved, and that a part of our people and some of our states should not imagine that there is no more vital principle or broader question at issue than the interests of slave owners and the right of emigration into uninviting and inhospitable territories. In other words, what he's saying is that what they're trying to do right now is boil the issue between the North and South down to the interests of a few slave owners and the right of those slave owners to go into the North and take their slaves with them. He's literally saying, I think this is page 2. He's literally saying, separation of the North and South seceding, they're trying to say it's all about the interest, because it's all the interests of the slave owners. And he's saying, no, don't mistake that. Goes on to say, this is important, abstract theories of government rarely enlist the passions of the people. Abstract theories of government rarely enlist the passions of the people. In other words, if I said, look, we got a fucking issue on our hands, man, right now. We've got all of these congressmen and senators and House of Representatives, and they're in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and they're all voting in a democracy, and we're supposed to be a republic. No, a Republican is a different, there's two different forms of government, really, that we're dealing with here. There's a Republican form of government and a Democratic form of government, and the Constitution was set up as a Republican form of government, which means we're supposed to people be like, what? What is, I don't really care about, but you say, black man was killed in the street. Let's fucking take to the streets! That's what you'll see. That's exactly what he's saying right now. When you actually have to deal with the actual problems of what's going on with the North and South and the war and all of these abstract theories of government, they rarely enlist the passions of the people. But if you tell them, hey, there's a bunch of whiteys killing the Negroes, now you got a war. Now you got a war. Albert Pike goes on to say, I, for one, have not deplored the agitation of the question of slavery. He's not trying to say slavery isn't a bad thing. He's like, that is a problem. We have to talk about that. But that's not what is going on here. The North is trying to convince the South. It's trying to convince the North. It's trying to convince all the people that are going to fight in the war. That's what it's about. It's about freeing the slaves. It was never about that. For in its discussion have been all the time involved the very essential nature and terms of the compact under which our national system exists. The questions to which slavery has given rise could not have remained unsettled nor been ignored. We were going to have to deal with slavery one way or the other, is what he's saying. But the North were saying, we're just going to crush you. But they weren't doing it because they were trying to free the black man The people in the North didn't give a shit about the Negroes either. It wasn't like they freed the Negroes and they're like, hey, come mate with our white people now. No, people in the North still found them subhuman. The people in the North, as we're going to find, thought that it was a class war. They thought the people in the South were a bunch of dumb fucking hicks, a bunch of redneck hillbillies that were unsophisticated like us Northerners. It was true. There was a conflict. The real controversy between them is as old as the Constitution itself. So there was a conflict between the North and South at the very signing of the Constitution. And what it was the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. There was one group of people that wanted a very strong federal government. And there was another group of people that were like, no, we just came from a king. And when you get a strong federal government, then power takes corruption and control and fucks everybody. Guess who won? Guess who won the Civil War? The Southern states hold, as Jefferson and Madison and all the anti-federal party held, that the general government is the result of a compact between the states. A compact made by the states, amendable by the states only, and dissolvable by the states whenever it fails to answer the purposes for which they created it. In other words, the compact of the United States, the federal government doesn't have control to tell the states what to do. The states tell the federal government what to do. And this has been an issue since the very foundation of the Constitution. And this is what was fomenting the war, the Civil War. This is what it was all about. Now, the North made it about slavery. Why? Because they needed a reason to get into war. The northern states, on the contrary, hold that there is no such compact, that the whole of the people of all the states as an aggregate and unit made the Constitution, and that there is no right of secession retained by the state. This is what pissed the Southern off. It wasn't like, we want to keep our Negro slaves, No, they realized that there was wholesale corruption happening in centralized federal government. And they were like, we're doing what we want to do, go fuck yourself. As Pike said, he did not even want to secede. He didn't even want to separate, but he was like, look, they're making us. That's not what you were taught in history, though, of course. Now, this is the radical difference of opinion as to the nature and the course of the powers of the general government. This is what the war was fought over. The radical difference of opinion as to the very nature of the course of the powers of the general government. Should the central government, should the federal government have the power that it has? When it does, what happens? That power universally corrupts. The southern states said, that's what's happening. And they're not going to concede. They're not going to just let us do our own thing. They're literally going to take us by force. We fight. What were you told, though? Bunch of redneck hillbillies down there just hating on the... Everybody had slaves. He who reflects on all this, cannot well fail to see that the separation was but a question of time. Sooner or later, the North and South could not help but divide, unless the powers of government were placed and kept in the hands of the wisest statesmen of each. They wanted to keep the power local. They wanted to keep the power into the people's hands, in the state, local, counties, that sort of thing, as opposed to what? All the power going to the feds. So now, this whole pamphlet, that was page 8 or something like that. This is page 22. It's all a bunch of legal mumbo jumbo. He was actually discussing the legalities of secession. Not, I want more slaves because I'm a Confederate general. The United States originally was set up in the Constitution to essentially be, every state was essentially its own country. And they were combining as a compact for safety. Saying hey, you're going to do your thing, we're going to do everything here and here and here, and you each have your own laws, your own standards, your own bylaws, your own Congress, all that sort of stuff, right? Your own Supreme Court, all that sort of stuff. You all act as your own autonomous unit, but together we will have that silver chain that links all of us together to protect ourselves. And Pike was right. I think what I've read of the Constitution and what I've listened to, Constitution classes and just reading once again, studying all this stuff, I think Pike was dead on. Look at the power the federal government has right now and look at it's destroying humanity. If the Union could have continued as it ought to have done, he didn't want to secede. He wanted to keep the country together. The Union, if the Union would have continued as it ought to have been done, and would have done if men had been wise, we should insensibly have become more and more one nation. Our common flag would have made us so. Time and habit would inevitably have consolidated us, and the antagonisms of race would have died out or combined in harmonious action. Let's read that one more time. Our common flag would have made us so. Time and habit would inevitably have consolidated us, and the antagonisms of race would have died out or combined in harmonious action. In other words, all of these issues that we're having with race right now, and we're going to cover, it wasn't just whites and blacks. That's a ridiculous thing to think. We're going to get to that. He's saying that if you would have just, if the federal government wouldn't have taken so much control and wanted to just invade the South and take over the South with their federal power, all of this talk of race issues and stuff like that and that would have all figured itself out. Why? Because it's stupid to enslave people. It's not even sustainable. Much of the zeal which is manifested among certain classes all over the North is only an outcropping of that intense hatred against the South which 30 years cultivation has produced. 30 years mainly because of newspapers and things like that. It was a class structure. They were the rich Northerners. But they were the rich Northerners, and they couldn't stand them hillbilly, fucking backwood, redneck, white trash Southerners. It was a class war. The North liberating the Negroes was not about the North were just these noble people. No, they still didn't give a shit about the Negroes. They didn't give a shit about the blacks in the South. The sober truth is that a revolution of some kind had become as indispensable as thunderstorms are to purify the stagnant atmosphere. The body politic, the government, the body politic had become sick, almost unto death. Self had become everything, and the country nothing. Corruption and the prostitution of public office and placed to private profit and become so almost universal and so little disgraceful that without a great change it was not impossible for the republic to endure. In other words, if you weren't going to change the corruption in government that led the whole thing, shit was going to get real bad. Then he goes on to say, the government had become a great market house in which everything was bought and sold. That's all it was. It wasn't there to maintain freedoms or protect the people anymore. It was just a place to sell goods through the corruption of the government. This was 160 years ago. And then he goes on to say, it was well said a year or two since in the Senate that our government was the most corrupt government on the face of the earth. 160 years ago, he was saying, White House, everything that's going on up there, this is why we have to defend. This is why we want to secede. This is why we're going to defend ourselves. Because shit's so corrupt that you might as well just upend the whole thing. The body politic had become sick, almost to death. Self had become everything. The country, nothing. Corruption and prostitution of public office for private profit. God, sounds a lot like today, doesn't it? Doesn't it? This was the end of this pamphlet, and he was this was before the war. And he was saying, he's like, look, I don't want to say that, I want to show the world that, and prove to the world that the great experiment has not failed and that men are capable of governing themselves. And he wanted to prove that to the world, that we don't need some monarch, we don't need some, whatever dictator or whatever it is, ruling us and telling us what to do. We can do it ourselves. We can govern ourselves. That's how he ends the thing. It's an impassioned plea for liberty and freedom for human beings. Of course, because it's wrapped up in slavery, right? The whole conversation is wrapped up in slavery. You can't have any other conversation about that. But what about the slaves? Arkansas wasn't even a cotton-growing state. Arkansas, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, Albert Pike was saying it, the cotton-growing states, Arkansas not one of them, they didn't even have the mass plantations of slaves. This really gets to the whole conversation as we're talking about of Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, right? This is what he was talking about, Albert Pike was talking about, that this was the conflict that was at the foundation of the very signing of the Constitution. It was the issue between the North and the South. It was the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The South were Anti-Federalists. The North were Federalists. The North said they supported removing some powers from the states and giving more powers to the national government, favored dividing powers among different branches of the government, basically taking all that consolidated power and making more of it. proposed a single person to lead the executive branch. This is the Federalists. The Anti-Federalists wanted important political powers to remain within the states. They wanted the power to remain local. So if they had to deal with corruption, they could deal with it locally. They wanted the legislative branch to have more power than the executive. I agree. Feared that a strong executive might become a king or a tyrant, or that the whole thing would be tyrannical and kingly, which is exactly what we have right now. It don't matter who gets in office. Believed a Bill of Rights needed to be added to the Constitution to protect people's rights. That's exactly what that actually happened. So one of the other things that actually started the war was this. It was the greenback. So the greenback was the greenbacks were paper currency, printed in green on the back, issued by the United States during the American Civil War. They were in two forms: demand notes and United States notes, issued in 1861, 1862 respectively. They were legal tender by law, but were not backed by silver and gold. Only the credibility of the United States government. So in other words, no credibility. So this was the first time, the introduction of greenbacks by the United States government was the first time that, guess what? Money wasn't backed by shit, which means what? They could mess with finance, which means what? They're messing with your currency, which means what? They're messing with your current, which means what? They can take your energy and make it go this way. It's worth this much. Oh, no, it's only worth this much. Oh, and now it's only worth this much. And it's this much and this much. Oh, and here we go. And now we're down into Hades, and that's how much you're worth. This was the first time the gold standard was released. It didn't last, I don't think, and then I think they took it finally in like 1913 or something like that. But this was the push. This is all the federal government trying to take control of what? Your currency, your money, your worth. This is what the South was fighting. This is what the South was fighting. Now, just in case you want to know, to reiterate this point about how everyone in the South, lots of people in the North too, but many people in the South knew of the corruption, knew what was going on. This actually comes from the Black Hills. Look at this. Rapid City, South Dakota, right? So, look at this. This is the double rate of interest, the Cuckoo's Bank of Wall Street. Look at this. They knew what was going on right there. You had usury coming in. You had the absolute manipulation of our financial system, which could ultimately enslave everybody. So yeah, the North might have freed the blacks, but only to enslave them more. Yeah, sure, women got the right to vote, right? And that was such a good thing that women got the right to. How could you say that's a bad thing? Do you know why women got the right to vote? So that they could tax them. They could tax women to eventually get them out of the home and get them in the workforce where they wouldn't be raising their children. This is what was going on, and it's going on today. America was unofficially already split into two countries before the actual secession in the 1860s. By the way, I didn't read this, but Pike was actually saying that a bunch of those states had already seceded. They were already going on their own. They were literally like, we're creating essentially our own country in this state. F you, North, whatever. We're just going on our own because we can't stand the corruption anymore. We need to be an autonomous unit. It wasn't like, we want to keep our slaves, that's it. At the height of the American slave trade, according to census records, okay, at the height of American slave trade, 1.5% of Americans owned slaves. As we'll find out of that 1.5% of Americans, once again, according to the statistics of like census records and what we're told, 78% of that 1.5% of Americans were Jews, not whites. We're going to go into all of that, okay? But everybody thinks it's the white man. We're going to cover that. This is what politically it looked like in the North and South. America was unofficially already split into two countries before the actual secession in 1860, and before the North sent down invading armies to impose their will on a people that wanted to be left alone. Remember, there were states that wanted to secede, that their main, like Arkansas wasn't a cotton-growing state. It wasn't slavery that was keeping Arkansas alive. That's what North and South looked like politically. They wanted to do their own thing, and the North had instead of actually being like, okay, let's just separate into two countries, you're going to have your own country, whatever, we're going to do our thing. The North like, no, we're coming for you. Why? Total and complete control. Let's just talk about race. This is something I filled out when I was still living in Oregon. But it says, hey, what's your race? Check all that apply. Now, let's just look at the problem with what you're given with race, okay? You're an American Indian or an Alaskan Native, which means that you were a native tribe and you were born in America, or you were a native tribe and born in Alaska. You're an Asian Indian. You're black or an African American. You're Chinese. You're Filipino. You're Guamanian, Japanese, Korean, Native Hawaiian, other Asian, other Pacific Islander, Samoan, Vietnamese, white. White. Okay, so the problem with this is, what is the problem with white here? Well, let's see. American Indian, so you're from America and you're native here. Okay, Alaska, you're from Alaska, you're native there. You're an Indian from Asia. Okay, so you're from Asia. You're African American, you're from Africa and or America or both. That's original. You're Chinese, you're from China. You're Guamanian, you're from Guam. Japanese, you're from Japan. Korea, you're from Korea. Native Hawaiian, you're from Hawaii. Asian, you're from Asia. Pacific Islander, you're from the Pacific Islands. Samoan, you're from Samoa. Vietnamese. Then where are white people from? Now you could say Slovakia, right? Like my mom is Svoboda, right? So she's like Czechoslovakian. So Slav means white. So you could say, well, people from the Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia and that whole area, Eastern European, I guess they're white, right? Because they're literally called Slav. But white is not all of these other distinguishing characteristics of race are all geographic areas. China, Hawaii, Korea, Japan, India, except what? White. Now that's a problem. Now that's a problem because you know what? If I put a sweatshirt on right now that said "proud to be white," how much shit would you get? Right? You'd be like a racist, right? But if I put a sweatshirt on that said "proud to be Irish," no problem, right? Well, there's no problem. Proud to be Irish? Yeah, it's your Irish heritage, right? I'm proud to be Swedish. I'm proud to be European. I'm proud to be Italian. Proud to be white. Ooh. No. You can't do that. White is a construct. White's not a thing. I'm not fucking white. I mean, I'm Slovakian, so I guess you could say I'm part Slovak there, sure. But I'm also Menominee Indian. I'm also Irish. I'm also German. I'm what? White is created. And why is white created? To whitewash all of your heritage, your where you were from, your language, your family, your religion, your geography, country, all of it. It's all whitewashed. It's all whitewashed by calling yourself white. Not white. I'm part Irish, part Slovakian. I was born an American. Part Menominee Indian. Very proud of my Irish past and Irish history and Menominee Indian history, all of that sort of stuff. Proud of that. Nowhere am I white, though. See the problem here? White is created to literally demonize and whitewash the history of different groups of people, masses of people, and ultimately create a race war. Whites against the blacks is what's going on right now. Well, next time somebody calls me white, I'm going to be like, you fucking racist? Why are you trying to whitewash my past? Here's my past. I'm Irish. Do you know how the Irish were treated in America? They were dirtbags. They were paddies. They were paddies. They were proddies. They were mix. These are all racial slurs for Irish people. They were treated like shit. Okay? This is help wanted, no Irish need apply. No Irish need apply. Irish and Negroes eat out back. It's really what it is. So the Irish were not looked at fondly at all. It's not like, oh, I'm European, I'm Italian, or I'm French, and it's like, oh, that's my brother over there. He's Irish. He's part of the white tribe here. No, they had those different countries and different people had no affinity to one another. Why? Because they were from different countries. They had different religions and stuff like that. Think about this. The Irish, they didn't even get along with one another. You had the Protestants and the Catholics. They're on the same fucking island, and they still can't get along. Then these people over here, these Irish, that couldn't get along with one another, when they came over here, they became white with the Italians and everybody else that had fair skin that was from Europe, whether it's Slovakian, Italian, Swedish, Switzerland, German, Irish, you all became white. And the Irish were looked down upon. This is the Irish identity in the British press. So you had the Irish people here, right? The Catholics and the Protestants, they couldn't stand one another. They were fighting with one another, and they're of the same race, on the same fucking geographic place, practically the same religion, from the same source, right? The whole thing. They couldn't get along. Then you went over and across the aisle over there, and you said, hey, what did the British think of the Irish? There's an entire, this is a book, and it's all about, in the British press, making Irish people look like monkeys. Now, if you made a black person look like a monkey in any press today, what would happen to you? Racist! Look at this. We tear down. Everybody would lose their shit, right? Here's an entire book of 100 years of the British press, whites, literally classists, looking down on Irish people as fucking monkeys. Then they move here, and they all became white. This is all fabricated. All to do what? Enslave everybody and have everybody hating on one another. Whitewashing your history. So, the reason I'm bringing this up is, do you guys know Noel Ignatieff, whatever this guy? This guy is a walking, talking, ginormous pile of shit. People also search for David Horowitz. This guy, Noel Ignatieff, or whatever his name is, he's a Jewish historian. Very, make sure you keep the asterisk on historian there. This guy wrote a book called How the Irish Became White, and provides a glimpse at the social evolution of the Irish in the years surrounding the Civil War, as they transitioned from an oppressed and unwelcome social class to members of the white racial class. In other words, he wrote an entire book on how when the Irish came to America, their history was essentially whitewashed, and they became the whites now, as opposed to just proud to be Irish. Now, what's interesting about this is he goes on to say how the Irish became white. Okay? This is a Jewish historian saying this. And this guy said he wants to abolish whiteness.
My concern is doing away with whiteness. Whiteness is a form of racial oppression, sure. The suggestion is that it is somehow possible to separate whiteness from oppression, and it is not. There can be no white race without the phenomenon of white supremacy. If you abolish slavery, you abolish slaveholders. In the same way, if you abolish racial oppression, you do away with whiteness. Treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity.
Your views are fairly well received in academia.
Yes, they're legitimate, not to say that everyone agrees, but sure. I could not point to any examples where it has provoked political censorship. Whiteness is an identity that arises entirely out of oppression. Whiteness is not a culture, it's not a religion, it's not a language, it's simply an oppressive social category. Blackness is an identity that can be plausibly argued.
And Ignatieff was the co-founder of a new abolitionist society. Except this new abolitionist society, editor of the journal Race Trader, he promoted the idea that treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity. And this guy, who's a Jew, wants to abolish the white race, wrote a book saying that the Irish, well, when they came here, they became white. See what's going on here? Our history is being whitewashed. So we can be an autonomous, non-color, white's a non-color, by the way, be a non-color, group us all into a hatred and blah, 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 racism, and destroy. All you YouTube censors that want to say anything about what I'm about to cover, you can go fuck yourself. Fuck yourself. Racism is specifically, I'm not saying specifically only Jewish, but specifically Jewish. Because their religion teaches them that they're chosen over everybody. They're so chosen that not only is a Jew a religion, it's also a race. We're so chosen, we're so better than everybody, God literally placed us down as the heart of humanity and everybody has to serve us. This is in their eschatology and their theology. It is completely 100% racist. Now, if you actually call that out in any social media platform, what happens? You get booted, don't you? You can call out Freemasons all day. You're going to get booted. You can call out Muslims like David Wood, Acts 17 apologetics, that tall drink of water with a... Anyway, that guy, who I have zero respect for, that guy spends all day bashing on the muzzies and the slims. Never going to say one thing about Jews, are you? Because if you do, you know what happens. Jews are racist by their theology. They claim it. They'll scream it in the streets. Yes, we are racist. I made a whole video on it, but you can't watch that on YouTube because, well, you know, that's just what it is. So let's talk about who runs the media and who's directing all of this stuff today. Who's filling our heads with all of this race? Oh, everybody's racist. We need to take to the streets and talk about racism and deal with it and who's putting this into your head right now? Every single one. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, every single one of those. 6 Jewish companies control 96% of the world's media. NPR, CBS News, NBC, Fox News, 20th Century Fox, New York Times, CNN. Pick your poison. You're being taught that you're racist by racists. Racist. People that are not choosing to be racist, their theology tells them that they are. Now, why are we talking about this? Because it's well known that Jews dominated the slave trade, not whites. I'm not saying there weren't whites that were involved in slave trades. There were. 78%, accordingly, I've heard everywhere from anything from 75 to 80% of people that were involved in the slave trade owned slaves in America. Not just involved in the slave trade, owned slaves in America. 75, 80% were Jews. At the height of American slave trade, 1.5% of Americans owned slaves. 78%, 75% of those 1.5% were Jews. So white people all over the world, which are not white, unless you're specifically Slovakian, I suppose we could go, okay, you're kind of white. But other than that, your history was all whitewashed. You were told that you were involved in and that you still have white privilege and all this other stuff because of all the racism and all the slavery that the whites did, right? Meanwhile, it wasn't you at all. It wasn't your ancestors. It certainly wasn't my Menominee ancestors and my Irish ancestors that were considered monkeys. In other words, out of 100 people in the South, 98.5% of them did not own slaves. Slavery and the Jews, a secret relationship between blacks and Jews, Volume 1, which was a long history of showing how the Jews were directly involved with the slave trade. Some of the first synagogues, some of the biggest or like most oldest and first synagogues that were made in countries were just happened to be the main shipping ports of slaves. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. So Brazil, Jamaica, Barbados, Argentina, Suriname, Curacao. Notice that with the exception of Argentina, all these places were slave trading centers, and that the first synagogue in Argentina did not appear until the end of the 19th century. All this goes to show that when the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, uses the term canard, it's just a canard that the Jews were involved in the slave trade. No, they're just trying to bury history, just like they're trying to whitewash your history. Is it because now we can just go and actually do our homework, find out ourselves? Is the ADL telling the truth? Let me take a wild stab in the dark here. Let's just go and look. Negroes at auction. Levin, Marx, Leah Minis. What are these? These are Jewish names. Ben Mosey and Son, De La Mota, Isaac Mota, Mordecai. This isn't ideas that come from some anti-Semite. All of what we're talking about here was actually captured in a book called New World Jewry, 1493 to 1825. It's all about how the Jews dominated and ran the slave trade. This is a Jewish historian. His name is Seymour Liebman. Not an anti-Semite, not some white racist. This is a Jew keeping history of his people. The Jews were the largest ship chandlers in the entire Caribbean region, where the shipping business was mainly a Jewish enterprise. They came with ships carrying African blacks to be sold as slaves. The traffic in slaves was a royal monopoly, and the Jews were often appointed as agents for the crown in their sale. The ships were not only owned by Jews, but were manned by Jewish crews, and sailed under the command of Jewish captains. Why is it easy for the Jews to go and enslave and steal a bunch of people in Africa? Why was it easy for them to do that? Because their religion tells them inherently that those Africans and everybody else besides them are subhuman. It was easy. Who gives a shit? Just a black. He's not a Jew. He's not chosen. They're not the Jews. They're not the chosen ones. Who got to blame for it? The first 2 centuries of the black Jewish encounter in America were highly lighted by a fairly extensive record of Jewish slaveholding. Okay. Here's a list of Jewish slave-owning ships. Once again, why am I showing all this? Moses and Sam Levy, Roosevelt, Lyle, Gomez, Abrams, Levy, Franks, all of them. They were Jewish ships. They even the name of like the sails of Abraham and shit like that. Seriously. So why, when you look at why is Albert Pike demonized? Why did they start demonizing him right away? And it's lasted till today in the truth community. Why? They needed a scapegoat. It's the same reason why they blame Masonry for everything. You need a scapegoat. Oh, it's them guys over there in the secret lodge. They have meetings. They're not telling you what's going on to me. You could just go in and knock on the door and find out yourself. No, it's the Masons. Albert Pike was Luciferian. No. He was an orator, a poet, a statesman. He wanted to keep the Union together, and when he realized that the North was psychopathic and tyrannical, he took to arms, and he went and fought the war himself. He fought for Native Americans. He fought beside Native Americans. He wrote poems about Christmas. We must realize that our party's most powerful weapon is racial tension. By propounding into the consciousness of the dark races that for centuries they have been oppressed by the whites, we can mold them into the program of the Communist Party. Wait, I thought you said Masons were the communists. Wasn't that right, John? Why do Masons push communism? They don't. Who does, though? In America, we still aim for subtle victory while inflaming the Negro minority against the whites. We will endeavor to instill the white a guilt complex for the exploitation of the Negroes. We will aid the Negroes to rise in prominence in every walk of life, in the professions and in the world of sports and entertainment. With this prestige, the Negro will be able to intermarry with the whites and begin a process which will deliver America to our cause. And yes, that's true, and yes, you can look that up. Let's just take a look at this gentleman here. This is the Minnesota Freedom Fund. And this is the board president, and this is the guy that's, taking in BLM donations. He's doing all this sort of stuff, fighting for the blacks. And his name is Greg Lewin. That's, for all the yous that don't know, that's he's Jewish. He's Jewish. He has a religion that doesn't give a shit about you, doesn't give a shit about blacks, cares nothing but themselves. Written in their book, Greg Lewin. Minnesota Freedom Fund, he's one of the guys that's taking in literally millions of dollars of donations from BLM. Greg Lewin, board president. Greg is a graduate of Humphrey School of Public Affairs and works as a researcher for the Minnesota Private College Council. Greg volunteers with groups that fight structural inequities, build community resilience against fascism, and advocate the rights of workers and protesters. This literally is guy, as far as I can tell, is literally funneling money and ripping off a bunch of black people and doing it under the a Jesus or umbrella that, like, I'm there for the blacks, I'm there for freedom and stuff. It's nonsense. He's a fraud. He doesn't give a shit about BLM. They already took with one word, it's one syllable, white, not even a color. They took everybody's their genealogy, their heritage, their race, their religion, their geography. They took it all and went, whitewashed it all, and then said, demon. Demon. And in doing so, they're destroying Western civilization. You're seeing it in the streets. Cops are letting people tear down statues. Public property, no problem. What about all the people that took the time to build that? Doesn't matter. Albert Pike was the founder of the KKK. That's all I need to know. Tear the shit down. That's what you have happening in the streets. This is the percentage of hate symbols recognized by ADL by race. White. There's 0.5 black. So there's symbols that are recognized as a bunch of people hating, and with these symbols. And 99.5% of this, and this is an actual graphic, guys. This isn't made in like Microsoft Paint or some shit. This is an actual graphic from the ADL. I thought this was an Onion Babylon Bee infographic. Nope, this is what passes for a scientific database by the ADL. And it's targeting people based on race and identity. Whiteness. It's got to go. Whiteness has got to go. So the ADL is only recognizing hate by white people. Only white people hate. And that's essentially what you got. Pro-black is an anti-white. Empowerment. You switch that around, though, as everybody knows. Pro-white is an anti-black. Well, no, the thing is, it was like, when you say all lives matter, it was a black lives matter. Blah, blah, blah. Matter matters. Matter matters. Why? Because matter comes from material. So, any race, tribe, culture, civilization that's on this plane of existence matters. All matter matters. This is what's being beaten to your head. This is why this is literally propaganda. When you say all lives matter and they say, whoa, it's so stupid, dude. We're focusing on the black lives right now. Kind of tired of focusing on the black lives, personally. I think a lot of these blacks, personally, play victim all the time. They're not the victor, they're the victim. All of this, and this is being taught to the whites too, or the whites, if you will, is to play victim instead of being the victor. Instead of taking control of your life and deciding what's going to happen with your life, they play the victim all the time. And this is actually creating more and more of this right now. They're actually trying to create so black people can't even be criticized. They're doing the same thing that the Jews did with themselves. You can't criticize Jews, otherwise you kick off every platform. You call an anti-Semite, blah, blah. ADL is going to come after you. They're doing the same thing with blacks, so you can't criticize blacks. It's bullshit. Matter matters. You can criticize anything that's worth criticizing. Now, the people in the streets here that are tearing down Albert Pike here, they put a rope around a white man's neck and hung him in the square. That's what they did, right? Tore that. Look at that thing go down. Boom! Who gives a shit? Tear it down. Now, personally, I do care because I think this is madhouse. This is monkeys in the street. Not just the blacks, so the whites too. They're all just fucking monkeys. The uncivilized people. That's being completely uncivilized. None of those people. Let's play it again. None of these people. Are any of these people teachers or orators or lecturers? Have any of these people written a book of poetry? Did any of these people fight for what they thought was actually good, true, and right, and actually fight, take up arms? No, they're just in the street destroying shit that they don't understand. Did any of those people actually read Morals and Dogma? Have any of those people ever even looked into the halls of Freemasonic literature? Did any of those people in the street know anything about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and what was actually going on in the North and South? No. None of them. None of them have probably even picked up Morals and Dogma and ever even read a page. You can almost guarantee that everybody in that street, though, was like, what? Well, he's South, KKK, hated the blacks, that's all I need to know. Freemason, Luciferian, Illuminati. You know what's happening right there? All of those people are hypnotized, being brainwashed to destroy civilization. And they think they're on the side of good. Now, why do I say, who gives a shit if that statue comes down? A few reasons. Number one, it's I actually care because it's private property, it's public property, and you shouldn't just go and destroy shit. That's just not how civilization works. If you really want that thing taken down, take it to court or take it into your local jurisdiction or whatever, and then have it taken down. Don't just go and, haphazardly tie a bunch of ropes around a white man's neck and tear him down. Now, all of that said, who gives a shit if that statue went down? Who cares? It's just a dumb statue of a guy. And to me, the only statues that we really should be putting up, any buildings and things like that should be putting up that we want to stay, should be dedicated to God and God alone. Not to some Southerner, not to me, not to Obama or Trump or any of that. The monuments that we should be building are monuments to God. So personally, I don't, who cares if this, who cares if Pike went down? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. It's just a statue. Doesn't really mean anything. Now, these people think it means something, but it doesn't matter. Now, why am I saying this, that it doesn't matter that that statue went down? Because Albert Pike himself said, you know what? Who cares? This comes from the opening of Albert Pike's poems. And it says, when I am dead, I wish my monument to be builded only in the hearts and memories of my brethren of the ancient and accepted Scottish rite. When I'm dead, don't build any monuments to me. The monument and the effects and the change and the inspiration and things like that I've given to people, they're already builded in the hearts of those people. Well, Albert Pike, you great, great man as far as I can tell. You great man. You builded that monument in my heart. And that's why I'm doing this today. Who gives a shit? Let that statue fall. Let all those people, all those monkeys in the street think that they're tearing down a statue of the KKK. And what I want you to do is go pick up a copy of Morals and Dogma now. Read it yourself, and you tell me at the end of that, you think he's some Satanist. If you do, I would say you can't read. So this last thing I'll say. My suggestion is this to all the Masons out there. Any Mason that looks at what happened there and sees that exactly what it is, just an absolute destruction of civilized society, knew that Albert Pike was not the demon and Luciferian that everyone claims he is. All those Masons out there that know he is a good man, you know what you should do? Put a monument back up, right up on that pillar. Put a monument back up. But don't build a new freaking thing of Albert Pike and stuff. You know what you should do? Have a placard commissioned by the brothers. Put that quote on it. It wouldn't even be that much. They couldn't even tear it down. You could have it like welded in and like, you could put like some adamantine steel and shit like that. Put like, 8-inch frickin' lag bolts in that thing and just bolt it into the center of that thing and put that up. So that everybody knows that, hey, doesn't matter if that monument went down. His message, Albert Pike's message, is written in the true hearts, of people that knew what he was really all about. Okay? So that's my suggestion. Masons, you got a task.